Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be part 2 of Chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist. Again, this is part 2, Nietzsche's Naturalism. With respect to most of life's big questions, Nietzsche believes an honest thinker has no choice but to suspend judgment. Thus, in section 55 of the Antichrist, he writes, quote, "There are some questions that people are not entitled to decide the truth of. All of the ultimate questions, all the ultimate problems of value are beyond human reason." End quote. Footnote 225 cites the source. Subsequently, Nietzsche vehemently denies any supernatural interpretation of, or explanation for, any aspect of reality. All concepts suggesting anything unnatural, that is, anything unsubstantiated by the physical world we come to know during our lives on Earth, are, for Nietzsche, essentially nonsense and illusory. Consider Nietzsche's temper in the following passage. Quote, "When the natural consequences of an action are not natural anymore, but instead are attributed to spectral, superstitious concepts, to God, to spirit, to the soul, as exclusively moral consequences, as reward, punishment, warning, as a lesson, then the presuppositions of knowledge have been destroyed, and this is the greatest crime against humanity." End quote. Footnote 226 cites the source. Not only is such anti-naturalism dishonest, but he believes that engaging in such deception is ultimately unhealthy, which for him constitutes an even more egregious problem. In a moment, I will turn to a brief discussion of his famous distinction between master moralities and slave moralities, as it reflects his thoroughgoing naturalism and ties into his views on the utility of religion, most notably his scathing attack on Christianity and the Antichrist. First, however, I want to make a few remarks about traditional conceptions of morality, since they are at the crux of this distinction. Accordingly, I shall begin this part of the chapter by illustrating his skepticism regarding traditional moral views. I do this by way of a discussion of his reductionist ontology, showing how it undercuts traditional moral and religious thinking. Then I will seek to paint a clear picture of the master and slave mentalities that underlie master and slave moralities. In doing so, I will explain why Nietzsche associates religion with the slave mentality, and I will elaborate on the problematic nature of such an association, noting, for example, the dishonesty implicit in this kind of mentality. According to traditional conceptions of morality, there are certain values we should all embrace, as well as certain ways we should all behave. As a result, traditional moral claims are thought to prescribe particular values and actions. Moral claims are prescriptive, in that they are concerned with how the world ought to be rather than descriptive, in which case they would be concerned instead with simply how the world actually is. Hence, good values and actions signal those that are considered right and are consequently prescribed, while evil ones denote those that are deemed wrong and are thus devalued and discouraged. As a result of this prescriptive process, traditional moral theories, for example, utilitarianism and deontology, as well as, more importantly for my present purposes, the religions that inculcate such theories, canonize certain values, for example, equality and humility. Along these lines, while a lack of certain values, like not preferring vanilla ice cream, is not thought to be grounds for sincere reproach, a lack of others, like not valuing equality in society, is. Subsequently, in societies and cultures where these traditional moral views are favored, those who fail to endorse commonly preferred values are viewed unfavorably and often ostracized, and in instances where social institutions incorporate such moral theories, delinquents can be penalized in a variety of ways, ranging from general social alienation to imprisonment and even, in some cases, death. Footnote 227. Also, recall the related discussion of Mill's reflections on the power of public opinion in Part 2 of Chapter 1. End of footnote 227. Ultimately, there can be little doubt that Nietzsche is fundamentally amoral when it comes to these traditional conceptions of morality. After all, when analyzing traditional views of morality and beyond good and evil, he famously claims that, quote, "There are no moral phenomena at all, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena." End quote. Footnote 228 cites the source. Elsewhere, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he remarks, quote, "This is my way, where is yours? Thus I answered those who asked me the way. For the way, that does not exist." End quote. Footnote 229 cites the source. I also believe that this is why, in The Will to Power, footnote 230, I would be remiss if I did not mention that some scholars view the will to power unfavorably, suggesting that since it consists of a collection of unpublished manuscripts compiled posthumously by his sister, it should not be taken seriously as an expression of views Nietzsche is fully committed to. However, I do not share this viewpoint. I believe that its contents can nonetheless prove revealing and useful, as it is, after all, still ultimately Nietzsche who is responsible for the creation of the thoughts that are expressed therein. Moreover, the most common modern version of the text incorporates significant annotations by Walter Kaufmann, who tasked himself with remedying clear instances of corruption on the part of Nietzsche's sister. For these reasons, I have chosen to cite the book in my work. End of footnote 230. I'll go back and start that sentence. I also believe that this is why, in The Will to Power, footnote 230, Nietzsche claims it is his purpose to, quote, demonstrate the absolute homogeneity of all events and the application of moral distinctions as conditioned by perspective, to demonstrate how everything praised as moral is identical in essence with everything immoral. End quote. Footnote 231 cites the source. Indeed, in much of his work, Nietzsche denies that certain actions are ever justified, or that certain values are ever privileged in this traditional moral sense. That is, he suggests that there are no objectively right and good actions or values. In essence, it seems that Nietzsche's own moral view is characterized by his reluctance to endorse a traditional moral view. What distinguishes Nietzsche is his very opposition to the idea that there are universally binding or objective standards for actions. Hence, his reflections on morality do not constitute a moral theory per se, but rather a kind of critique of all such theories. In view of this, Nietzsche's own moral theory, like most of his philosophy, is primarily descriptive, not prescriptive. In his moral and religious reflections, he is chiefly concerned with describing the inner workings of various psychological mentalities, for example, master and slave, as well as of life in general, not with prescribing particular values and actions. In order to gain a better understanding of Nietzsche's naturalism and amoralism, it is also worth discussing his reductionist ontology. On his account, life consists of 1. Incalculable and purely natural drives, 2. Incessantly in flux, all 3. Perpetually seeking power, i.e. domination of other drives. First, Nietzsche suggests that human beings have a tendency to misconceptualize life, and he himself tends to speak of life in a much more reduced sense than one is ordinarily accustomed to hearing it talked about. For instance, in explicating what life is, Nietzsche claims that even the word plant is painfully misleading, for even to speak of a plant is to have, quote, invented a false unity which does not exist. The fact of a millionfold growth with individual and semi-individual initiatives is concealed and denied if we begin by positing a crude unity plant, end quote. Footnote 232 cites the source. As remarks like this suggest, Nietzsche thinks that there are instead millions of drives or life forces at work within every living being. Second, Nietzsche reduces reality to that which is immediately present at any given moment, in which case life is constantly becoming something completely distinct and entirely new with each and every moment. That is, it is constantly changing, or as he is apt to say, becoming. Finally, another of Nietzsche's central philosophical ideas, the will to power, suggests that all living beings, or drives, strive to exploit their environment for their own benefit, in an effort not simply to survive, but to flourish. The will to power is a prevalent theme throughout Nietzsche's writing, including the Antichrist. Very early on in the Antichrist, Nietzsche writes, quote, what is good? Everything that enhances people's feeling of power, will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything stemming from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power is growing, that some resistance has been overcome. End quote. Footnote 233 cites the source. In Nietzsche's view, as evinced by this notion of the will to power, life on earth is filled with conflict and differences, and there is a tendency for the strong to naturally flourish and survive, while the weak barely scrape by or perish. Nietzsche thinks that the will to power is in turn a notion that applies universally to the aforementioned manifold drives, and it ultimately constitutes what he means by life. Because it indicates that life is a chaotic struggle for power and that reality is constantly in flux, Nietzsche's reductionist ontology explains why he is so quick to dismiss traditional religious and moral views, according to which there is a right action that is objectively true and proper for everyone, everywhere. It also explains why Nietzsche suggests that nothing is true of existence in any objective and universal sense, be it moral or otherwise. Ultimately, notions of objectively right and wrong actions are entirely misguided for Nietzsche, and as we shall see in greater detail shortly, he reduces them to illusions that bring comfort. All we do have in reality are subjective values, i.e., I think this is good and this is bad. And Nietzsche refers to someone who does not deceive him or herself about this aspect of reality as a master. As soon as one attempts to objectify these subjective values and to think of values in terms of right and wrong, i.e., good and evil, one becomes what Nietzsche calls a slave. Thus, Nietzsche's amoralism is a major impetus for his famous distinction between master or noble and slave or chandala, footnote 234. Chandala is an Indian term signaling, quote, an Indian of low caste, end quote. And I cite the source for that. End of footnote 234. So I'll go back and read that. Thus, Nietzsche's amoralism is a major impetus for his famous distinction between master or noble and slave or chandala, footnote 234, moralities. And similarly, the distinction between individuals who possess a master mentality, i.e., those Nietzsche refers to throughout his writings as nobles, masters, free spirits, and overmen, and individuals who exhibit a slave mentality, whom Nietzsche often refers to collectively as the herd. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, quote, wandering through the many subtler and coarser moralities which have so far been prevalent on earth, or still are prevalent, I found that certain features recurred regularly together and were closely associated, until I finally discovered two basic types. End quote. Footnote 235 cites the source. Although this distinction is not a focal point in the Antichrist, he does reference it there too. For instance, when reflecting on the fruits of one of his earlier works, on the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche writes, quote, here for the first time the contrast is made clear between a noble morality and a chandala morality, born of resentment and impotent revenge, end quote. Footnote 236 cites the source. Similarly, when discussing the origin of Christianity, which he argues lies in Judaism and resentment, in section 24, Nietzsche again references On the Genealogy of Morality, where he claims that he, quote, introduced a psychology of the opposing concepts of noble morality and resentment morality, the latter originating out of a no to the former, end quote. Footnote 237 cites the source. Generally speaking, slave moralities reflect traditional moral theories and their moral prescriptions, while master moralities are thought to transcend the need to moralize in this traditional sense in the first place. Master moralities refrain from the habit of judging actions and values in the traditional moral sense, and instead move, quote, beyond good and evil, end quote. The implications of this master-slave distinction are far-reaching, and Nietzsche spends a good deal of time providing psychological analyses of the master and slave mentalities underlying these master and slave moralities, especially in his works predating the Antichrist. Moreover, Nietzsche clearly associates religion with slave moralities, as he does in section 45 of the Antichrist, where he associates Christianity in particular with slave morality, noting that, quote, Paul was the greatest of all apostles of revenge, end quote. Footnote 238 cites the source. This association of religion with slave morality should not be surprising, given that most religions clearly endorse a traditional moral view of values and actions. Also recall from chapter 1 that religions are often credited with propagating traditional moral values. I believe Nietzsche's master-slave distinction can help shed light on his criticism of religion, so I now turn to a more detailed analysis. Through his works, Nietzsche offers a fairly detailed description of slave moralities and of the slave mentality. The slave mentality is signaled first and foremost by an obsession with the pain and suffering implicit in life. Fear about reality, i.e. that life is rife with conflict, full of danger, and entails suffering, plagues the slave mentality. In this vein, Nietzsche argues that many religious individuals cannot handle the truth regarding their earthly reality, especially the pain and suffering associated with it, and that they elaborate self-deceptions, which I will discuss in more detail in Part 3, as a result. This is reflected in his discussion of the psychology of redemption in section 30 of the Antichrist, where he writes, quote, the instinct of hatred for reality, the consequence of an extreme oversensitivity and capacities for suffering that does not want to be touched at all because it feels every contact too acutely, end quote. Footnote 239 cites the source. In a similar manner, Nietzsche suggests that slave moralities emphasize comfort and the preservation of the herd in an effort to mitigate the slave's acute sense of pain and suffering. On his account, slave moralities cater to the herd mentality, which aims to ensure that everyone survives and lives as comfortably as possible in virtue of the considerations of others it expressly requires. The universalization of values and actions through moral maxims ostensibly renders the world a less dangerous place because embedded within the traditional moralizing process is an implicit suspicion of and contempt for outliers who stray too far from the norm. And naturally, the more prominent this herd mentality becomes, the less likely it is that these anomalies will exist in the first place. Preoccupied with the threat posed by others, slaves react by attempting to get everyone to subscribe to a particular set of values, which, if adhered to, are thought to produce the most comfort and security. Ultimately, moral ideals help buffer slaves from the distress implicit in their lives by imploring all to be good, meaning in essence to be normal, obedient, and most importantly, less dangerous. In view of this, Nietzsche distinguishes values from the slave's perspective by using the terms good and evil, where good indicates all that is normal, expected, and therefore comfortable, and evil signifies all that is unique, unexpected, and therefore dangerous. In the end, Nietzsche argues that fear is the mother of slave moralities, footnote 240 cites the source, and not surprisingly, that from the slave's perspective, quote, what is new is always evil, end quote, footnote 241 cites the source. Consequently, while the values of a master are merely thought to be the product of his or her own personal expression, the slave's values are said to be primarily, if not entirely, dictated by others and his or her relationship to them. Accordingly, one of the hallmarks of the slave mentality is sincere concern for the welfare of others, and offering pity for the plight of others is viewed favorably, if not deemed obligatory, by those who have this mentality. The upshot is that traditional moral views, as well as the religions inculcating them, require us to act like slaves insofar as they implore us to set aside, at least to some degree, our own self-interest for the sake of others. This in Nietzsche's view, also makes them unnatural, which, not surprisingly, renders them a significant object of derision for him. All of this goes to show why, with respect to Christianity, Nietzsche concludes that, quote, the fear of pain, even of infinitesimal amounts of pain, this could end up only as a religion of love, end quote. Footnote 242 cites the source, given that he thinks, quote, love is the state in which people are most prone to see things the way they are not, end quote. Footnote 243 cites the source. By contrast, masters are defined in part by their lack of concern regarding the values of others or the assimilation of common values, and Nietzsche believes that by accentuating individual well-being and accepting and even encouraging individual differences, master moralities actually minimize the importance of outward concern for others. Indeed, instead of attempting to universalize his or her values, the master seeks to distinguish them, encouraging the creation of new and more personal values. For a master, what matters most is not whether an action achieved this or that specific result, or whether it was in accord with particular popular and privileged values, but whether it was performed boldly and with passion. What's more, what distinguishes boldness and passion is in part the degree to which one swims against the current. The herd mentality may produce a greater sense of security and comfort, but Nietzsche, presumably considering himself a master, believes this comes at a significant cost. While quantitatively humanity gains from such efforts, i.e. more human beings may survive, qualitatively it loses some degree of distinction, which is to say, on Nietzsche's account, value. And this is one reason why Nietzsche does not value slave moralities. Normality may yield numbers, but only distinction is thought to produce greatness, significance, and beauty. According to Nietzsche, one who properly understands his or her values will keep them to him or herself. For this, i.e. their personal and subjective nature, is precisely wherein he thinks their true value lies, that is, in their being different, interesting, and noteworthy. Along these lines, he warns us that, quote, whatever kind of bizarre ideal one may follow, one should not demand that it be the ideal, for one therewith takes from it its privileged character. One should have it in order to distinguish oneself, not in order to level oneself. End quote. Footnote 244 cites the source. For this same reason, Nietzsche's, quote, philosopher of the future, end quote, in Beyond Good and Evil declares, quote, my judgment is my judgment. One must shed the bad taste of wanting to agree with many. Good is no longer good when one's neighbor mouths it. And how should there be a common good? The term contradicts itself. Whatever can be common always has little value. End quote. Footnote 245 cites the source. Unlike masters, slaves create no new values, since they actively pursue the assimilation of universal values, proffered and preferred by the herd. And this means that they make no appreciable difference in the grand scheme of things and are, therefore, of no real significance. In sum, Nietzsche believes that slaves seek, above all, to diminish the pain and suffering inherent in life by establishing a communal situation that promotes the least amount of danger for everyone, instead of embracing life in its entirety and seeking beauty, significance, and true value like masters. As we shall see in greater detail, he views the slave's obsession with pain and suffering and their concomitant attempt to universalize values as a sign of weakness and disease. Nietzsche ultimately prefers that we foster a society in which the highest human beings, i.e. masters, flourish, even if it must be at the expense of those who are diseased and weak, and he would gladly trade in any perceived quantitative successes associated with societies and cultures that embrace the slave mentality for the more qualitative success he associates with those embracing a master mentality. Indeed, Nietzsche's endorsement of master morality is clear throughout most of his works, including the essay Homo, where, as Wicks points out, quote, he claims that he is destiny because he regards his anti-moral truths as having the annihilating power of intellectual dynamite. He expects them to topple the morality born of sickness, which he perceives to have been reigning within Western culture for the last 2,000 years. End quote. Footnote 246 cites the source. Additionally, in the Antichrist, Nietzsche remarks that, quote, the weak and the failures should perish, first principle of our love of humanity, end quote. Footnote 247 cites the source. These kinds of remarks suggest that Wicks is right when he claims that, quote, Nietzsche alternatively philosophizes from the perspective of life located beyond good and evil, and challenges the entrenched moral idea that exploitation, domination, injury to the weak, destruction, and appropriation are universally objectionable behaviors. End quote. Footnote 248 cites the source. For Nietzsche, this is just how life works. Hence, it's what he thinks is natural. Alternatively, those endorsing the slave mentality perpetuate what is unnatural, which is why Nietzsche does not value the slave mentality. On this point, Wicks writes, quote, Nietzsche ultimately advocates valuations that issue from a self-confident, self-reinforcing, self-governing, creative, and commanding attitude, as opposed to those that issue from reactive attitudes that determine values more mechanically, subordinately, and opposingly to those who are inherently more powerful. For Nietzsche, those who prefer to think in terms of good versus bad exemplify the former, leading and superior mentality, and those who think in terms of good versus evil exemplify the latter, inferior and subservient mentality. End quote. Footnote 249 cites the source. As Wicks suggests here, Nietzsche represents the value judgments of a master by using the terms good and bad, where good just indicates whatever he or she happens to value, and bad whatever he or she happens to despise, with no moral implications or undertones in either case. That is, masters do not attempt to objectify values, and thus master morality is, quote, beyond good and evil, end quote. In view of the traditional conceptions of morality discussed earlier, then, there really is nothing moral about master moralities. I believe that Nietzsche's problems with religion primarily stem from his analysis of the slave mentality and his belief in its fundamental incompatibility with his thoroughgoing naturalism. I now turn to a more detailed analysis of what I think are his two chief objections to religion. I will begin by discussing why Nietzsche believes religion entails dishonesty, part 3, and then move on to discuss why he thinks it is unhealthy, part 4. As we shall see, Nietzsche thinks that slave deceptions, such as otherworldly notions and moral standards, simply do not hold up upon close intellectual scrutiny, and he would certainly echo many of Mill's criticisms regarding the intellectual unsustainability of supernatural religions mentioned in Chapter 1, especially in Section C of Part 3. Moreover, from Nietzsche's perspective, whatever enhances earthly life is good, and whatever saps the instincts for life is bad. Notice that I use the contradistinction good and bad here, and not good and evil. And he argues that religion ultimately does the latter. So again, that was part 2 of Nietzsche's Naturalism of Chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thank you.